Joining me now here in Washington is Joseph Smits. He's former Inspector General for the U.S. Defense Department. From New York, we are joined by Richard Bistrong. He is an anti-bribery consultant who has operated undercover for the FBI, and he's also done some time in prison for bribery. And with us here in the studio is James Cohen. He's with the U.S. Institute of Peace and focuses on corruption in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. Thank you so much all for joining us. Joseph Smits used to oversee corruption investigations. Just how widespread is it? We heard $50 million there in the report from John Gilmore, but it could be a lot more extensive than that, correct?
Well, that's right. Those are the 50 million that we've actually caught. I would say it's about as widespread as human nature is. I mean, the fact of the matter is the military leadership code requires vigilant and inspecting people placed under your command, and it's because things happen.
Does the fog of war add to that, though?
Yes.
In what ways?
Well, it just exacerbates human nature. I mean, you put people under stress, and it exacerbates human nature. It's just the way God made humans.
Richard Bistrong, do you agree with that? Is it human nature? But also, of course, we're talking about very large sums of money when you're talking about war machines. $4 trillion we saw in that report spent on Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of it in cash. That's got to add to the temptation on top of the sprinkling of human nature.
Well, Nathan, I think from the perspective in my experience with foreign overseas military entities, I think one needs to think about what those environments are like. In many of the regions, including Iraq and Afghanistan, Nathan, the institutions of state are weak. And what I mean by that is the procurement personnel are poorly trained. They're often poorly compensated. And the procurement regulations in many of these countries and regions, well, Nathan, they're deliberately confusing. And when that happens in some of these territories, bribes are almost baked into the economic order. So as Joe was commenting before, the temptation is always there. And I'm just speaking about the demand side right now.
Yeah, James, pick up on that because it's an interesting point. Is Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, unique in encouraging this sort of corruption amongst the U.S. military?
I don't think it's unique. I think it's a context that any stabilization force or any intervening force is going to have to face going into, as Richard said, a weak rule of law environment. And it's something that you need to assess before going in. You need to take account of the landscape. You need to do an assessment of what's the situation of rule of law. And the military and any intervening force needs to have the safeguards in place, whether that be training, whether that be codes of conduct, whether that be oversight standards to help protect themselves to just about any situation. By nature, a conflict or fragile situation is going to have a lack of rule of law that you have to be aware of.
Is there lack of just checks and balances, especially when we saw the quick deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, lots of switching out of tours of duty, for example?
Well, there are two things. Checks and balances are one thing. Switching out of tours and duties is another. But fundamentally, if you think about our society, we have a constitution. And the Constitution is a system of checks and balances. Vertical, horizontal, federal, state, three different branches. All of those checks and balances are designed to prevent abuses of power.
But does this happen in the armed forces?
Of course it happens. But we have our own. We live under the Constitution and the armed forces, and we have our own uniform code of military justice. These are all designed to check human nature. There's an old saying from our founding fathers, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. Yeah,
I want to go to James because in Iraq and Afghanistan, you had a lot of contractors who were paid extremely well compared to the soldiers on the ground. There was a lot of cash around as well. I read somewhere that some soldiers, multiple tours of duty, are not a popular war. They kind of see the temptation and think, I kind of deserve this. What do you think to that?
As to anything of the specifics of the cash that was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, I'd defer to Joseph or Richard. But in that case, in any trying to combat corruption, I agree, there's human nature, and you need carrots and sticks to combat it when there's the temptation, especially in a weak rule of law setting. So some people might think, maybe I deserve it a bit And the carrots and the incentives would be having those structures in place. A lot of military personnel, a lot of police personnel want to do their job effectively. And if they know the consequences of engaging in corruption in the field and what that creates to achieving their goal, a lot can be dissuaded. And even the incentives, it's too risky. There will always be people that want to engage corruption, and those people you do need the strict punishments. So it's a balancing act.
Richard Bistrong, you've been on both sides of the law in this. Were you tempted, and how big is the temptation in terms of the arms industry that you've obviously had a lot of exposure to? But it is a moral question involving large sums of money as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there are a number of elements to that, Nathan. The temptation is absolutely, and it's small and it's big. Because in the world of procurement, particularly foreign procurement, this procurement instability that I described populates requests for small bribes. So it's almost like a gateway drug where you think of petty bribery, and you're not really considering the consequences of some of these societies which operate as criminal regimes, where small bribes are shared up and across the organizational chart in these ministries. So unfortunately, and I embrace this illusion, Nathan, you start to think from the supply side, you embrace sort of an ethical unawareness of the consequences of bribery. And even worse, you might even come to, as I did, think of it as a win-win at the front lines of international business, which is an unfortunate, but I think widely embraced dynamic from the perspective of the field of international business.
Joseph Smits, can you give us some examples of the sort of fraud cases that you've come across, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan? How does this happen?
Well, we had immediately after going into Iraq, I remember we had some instances where people were just counterfeiting and printing out dinars, and then and it was rampant, and people were getting away with it because there simply weren't police forces in place to oversee it. And
counterfeiting what? I mean,
counterfeiting cash. They literally had counterfeiting operations that we busted in Iraq while I was the Inspector General. And the other things that sort of the standard corruption that we saw is, if you think about Abu Ghraib, where our soldiers were doing bad things with prisoners and with each other. And it was a very embarrassing chapter in American history. And the problem was ultimately that the commander just wasn't getting out and inspecting. And it's easy to sit in your room in a war zone because it's safe, but that's just part of human nature. The leaders have to get out and exercise leadership.
One case I was looking at was oil fraud, where U.S. military personnel were siphoning off their own U.S. military oil fuel and then selling it locally. That's quite incredible that you would actually steal fuel from your own soldiers and then sell it. I mean,
that happens not only in war zones. I actually saw that happening in the United States. Yeah, military oil being siphoned off.
So you're saying this is not just Iraq and Afghanistan, this has happened in Vietnam, this has happened in Korea, this has happened in World War II?
Well, I don't know about Korea and World War II. I presume it happened. Human nature hasn't changed. And that's why we have the Code of Military Conduct. That's why we have court-martials. That's why we have to hold people accountable when they break the rules.
But are they being held accountable? James, can you come in here as well? Because a lot of people get away with this or don't get prosecuted. What more can be done to make sure crimes are found out?
To make sure, I think basically it's giving the proper powers to the investigative authorities and making sure that their offices are properly funded, their mandates are clear, and that they have access to do their investigations, and that there's the scope and the importance placed on it. And I think based on lessons learned coming out of the last 15 years, corruption as an issue in war zones or within security in general is the importance of it is being recognized more and more. So hopefully, as a lesson learned being brought into militaries and peace-building organizations, they'll place that right up at the forefront to empower these organizations.
Richard Bistrong, in New York, just how tempting is it out there? You've been in the arms trade for a long time. How many people get tempted? And do they really weigh the risks, considering the large potential rewards?
Well, Nathan, it's exactly as you just said. It's a calculation. What are the benefits of engaging in corruption versus what are the risks of being caught and the consequences of being caught? And I think for many on the front lines where incentives, we're talking about bonus formulas, quotas, forecasts, are all indexed to, very aggressive growth, especially in some of these frontier markets, which these high-risk areas represent. I think the temptations are very strong. So you might have, a compliance and an anti-bribery program that speaks to the social goals of we don't bribe, but a win above all else compensation plan that might cause people at the front lines of international business to ponder, what does management really want? Do they want anti-bribery compliance or do they want business growth? Because the way I'm trained and the way I'm compensated, I can't really deliver both. And when those at the front lines start pondering and indexing their paycheck to the risks, they're making those decisions on the fly, Nathan. And as I share from my own experience, I think that's to everyone's peril.
Did you ever have any moral quandaries doing what you did?
Shameful as it is to say, Nathan, I didn't. And I think that is definitely attributable to the ethical unawareness that I had at the time that I was traveling 250 days a year, living, working, and residing overseas for 10 years. I wasn't spending my free time on the Transparency International website. I wasn't thinking about how these regimes are really criminal structures. I was thinking, how is this a win-win at the front line? And really, Nathan, even worse, I was thinking, who's really getting hurt here? So there was an unhealthy distance between my own behavior and how societies really suffer as a result of bribery and corruption.